Hey everybody, just a quick note before this week's show. I just got back from Philadelphia, very sick on the train home. So I was a little out of commission for a minute, but I'm catching back up on everything. I had a wonderful time in Philly at the last, at least for a while, Everse Equinox Reading Series event hosted by Ernie Hilbert and Luke Stromberg, Tim Donnelly, and I think it went really well, as did several other really great local poets, including Slee Ricketts listeners, Vincent and Coleman was almost read. His wife, Anne Grace, threatened to put him up to read, but he was humble as always, and very funny. It was a really great time. I met a ton of wonderful Philly people, including my cousin Francis. I mean, I'd met him before when he was a kid, but it was great catching up with him. He is a writer, Francis Bass, sci-fi writer. Angela, Fleury, Steve Tier, former guest, and their delightful daughter Margie, along with Tom Lester, Catherine, Bree the barmaid, and a very enthusiastic poetry lover / business analyst who introduced herself as Too Much McGinnis. And I had a lovely time all around and got my shoes shined unexpectedly in the middle of the night at a bar in central Philly. So I could not have gone better. Grateful for all of that, and grateful to everybody who turned out. I will also be doing an event online with Jimmy Pappas this Thursday. It's a kind of a funny thing. He does a salon reading series thing, and he and I kind of went back and forth a little bit. I'm still not totally sure what it's going to be, but I just sent him a document tonight of some of the poems we're going to talk about. I think it's going to be kind of a discussion. Like, I think sometimes people just read their own work. I'm going to read I'm going to read half my own poems and half other people's poems. I've got a bunch of really good poems picked out, including some by friends of the show, Maury Creech and Shane McRae. I think it'll be something fun. I don't totally know what to expect, but there is sort of a theme. They are all sort of brokenhearted love songs. The theme title I gave, as you know, I'm terrible with themes, but I gave Jimmy the title Love's Bystanders. So we will see how that goes. I think it should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. That will be this Thursday, March 21st at 7 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. I will include a link in the show notes. Jimmy says he prefers if you show up early, but you are welcome to show up late. Either way, we look forward to seeing you there. One last note, just because this entire episode is dedicated to one issue of a contemporary poetry magazine that I think is good, but just to balance out any praise I give them over the course of the episode, I started out with a little bit of gossip and ribbing, including the note that once upon a time I was directly personally solicited to submit to this magazine and then form rejected subsequently. And then today, this morning, after I had already recorded this episode, after all of that, I'd been personally solicited again. And then this morning I got my second consecutive form rejection from them. So if nothing else, this is a magazine with some real integrity. They do not just publish their friends. It seems sometimes they do not even publish their friends. Smith, and you're listening to Slee Ricketts, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So I'm in Philadelphia, and what I should really be doing is figuring out what the hell I'm going to read tomorrow night, which means I thought this would instead be a great time to procrastinate by recording a podcast episode. It's something I've wanted to talk about for a couple weeks now. I got the most recent issue of 32 Poems, which is a poetry magazine that is not sponsoring the show yet. It's a really good issue, and there's enough in it that I wanted just to talk about things in these pages. So since they are not sponsoring the show. I don't just want this to be log rolling. I do know David Clark, who is the editor, who along with his lovely wife. What you say, lovely wife? You don't say lovely husband, I guess. David, Elizabeth's lovely husband. She's the managing editor, and he's the editor in chief. And a bunch of other smart people also work there. I do know him. I've published there, and I've some prose on the website and a poem, one poem in their pages. But I don't just want to do a promotion piece. So let's see. I thought before I talk about the poems in this issue, I should do some 32 Poems gossip. 32 Poems is a little magazine. I think it was started in Lubbock, I believe. The Texas Tech, I think, is where it started, under John Poch, who's a poet as well. And I'll just say this: I don't know much about the earlier days of 32 Poems, which it is, by the way. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's a very slender volume. It comes out now twice a year. I don't know if it used to or not. But it contains just 32 poems, and they are typically just one page per poem, although that's not strictly always the case. They do tend to favor short poems. It's 32 poems, and that's it. There's no prose. There's no nothing else. That's all it is. And I did not used to submit there in the old days because the story when I was in grad school was that it was a closed shop, meaning you could submit, but basically they only published people they knew or people they solicited. That is true of like a lot of magazines. I don't know that it was true at the time. It is what I heard at the time. But again, grad school gossip is grad school gossip. It is like a real problem with a lot of magazines. They take submissions, but they effectively don't. They're not. It's decorative. Sometimes it's in the worst cases, it's just a way to raise money because you pay to submit and then you're not actually paying for anything because you're not going to get in. That is what Deborah Treisman has all but said about fiction at the New Yorker. They thankfully don't take fees, so there's not. It's a little better, but yeah, the story in the old days was that 32 Poems was a closed shop. It's not a closed shop anymore. It's also, I should say, like, I don't have a lot of sway. I mean, I have almost no sway. I have a couple people recently have asked me to help out with some things, and I'll just say, like, it turns out I have, however little sway I thought I had, I may have less. And definitely not at 32 Poems. I mean, I'm friends with David. I'm going to be reading with him in Cleveland along with Ryan Wilson in June. But I will tell you how little of a closed shop 32 Poems is. I wrote to him specifically recommending the poetry of a friend, and he very kindly agreed to read it and then very kindly rejected it. And before that, he solicited work from me and then form rejected it. So it is, I mean, an honest man. David Clark is an honest man, and 32 Poems is not a closed shop. That is a real deal magazine to submit to. And a very good poet, I know, I won't name him here. I was talking recently about contemporary magazines, and he just said straight out, like, that's the only contemporary poetry magazine he still goes to, like, bothering to expect to find good things on a regular basis. I wouldn't go that far, in part because I also work for a poetry magazine. I did not mention that at the time, but I think that one also is pretty good. But 32 Poems is sort of quietly, humbly, like a really reliable magazine. That doesn't mean it's always going to blow your mind, but it does tend to mean, as this other poet pointed out, that you're going to encounter people whose work you don't know that is worth paying attention to. And you're also going to encounter some people whose work you might already know, and they generally, they're not sending 32 Poems their C material, which is often the case with names that are recognizable. So this issue, which is just the winter 2024 issue, I will say their cover design seems to have gotten less cutesy. They went through a phase where it was real cartoony, and they would do like goofy joke lists on the back. Sometimes those are kind of funny. Sometimes they were not so funny. They've gotten a little more neat and clean and stripped down in recent years, which I think it's nice. It's like it's actually a pretty little magazine. So I read this one front to back in a sitting, which is also nice. You know, when it's just 32 poems, you can do that. You can go through it pretty quickly. And I thought like there was like an unusual number of like worthwhile poems in here. I'll start with a couple. I'm not going to read them in order because I wouldn't group them in order. I mean, I mentioned on another episode that I thought every poem in here pretty much was hand stitched, meaning I didn't really notice any slabs of ready-made language. It seemed like there was real care put into the production of every phrase and line. Phrase more than line. The line, you know, I would say some of the poems could have been prose, but were sort of visually broken into lines. But every phrase was made with care. Phrase and clause. I made that distinction with Alice. A clause, by the way, I only learned this, a couple of years ago. The difference between a clause and a phrase is that a phrase is a string of words. A clause is a string of words that contains both a subject and a predicate. Now, the difference between a clause and a sentence, so a sentence can be a clause. A sentence has to have at least one independent clause in it. An independent clause is a clause. Obviously, it's a string of words that contains a subject and a predicate, but it's not. It doesn't have any conditions that require an additional clause. So you can turn an independent clause into a dependent clause just by adding a word. So we went to the market is an independent clause. It's a complete sentence. When we went to the market is a dependent clause, right? Because that when makes that clause dependent on another one. When we went to the market, my ex-wife showed up. Or I don't have an ex-wife, but so I would be very surprised if she showed up at the market. All right, that's been your weekly grammar lesson. Generally speaking, there's a high level of care taken with the language throughout, and I do appreciate that. That's not the most exciting thing. I know there are people who sort of what they most look for in poetry is the freshness of the language, or what is the term Cameron's always using? Not crimped. He always wants language to be a vortex. He always wants it to be crackling and bubbling over with new possibilities. That's good. I mean, I think at least have it be fresh, right? You don't want it to be. It's like poetry is like produce. Like being fresh is not going to mean that it's good, but you want it at least to be fresh. It's sort of my take. But let's see. Of the poems, I'll go from least to most in terms of the ones that interested me. So, but all of these I thought were interesting. Well, here, all right, this is the one that interested me least, but I thought was still made me think a little bit. Like, this is part of it, even if it's. And I remember talking to an editor about this, not David Clark, but a different editor about this a few years ago. That part of what you are doing when you put a magazine out is you're not saying these poems are all immortal. You're not even saying these poems are all good by the same measure. Part of what you're saying is these are all worth your time. These are all worth looking at. And maybe part of what I like is that they're kind of doing different things. Or maybe this one is just a poem I think is really exceptional as an instance of itself. And then this other poem I might not even especially but I think that it is getting at something worth getting at, or getting at something many people think is worth getting at, and it's sort of worth considering. It's worth considering as a as a thing to do, as a kind of poem. The part of your job as an editor is to provide a kind of survey of the current moment in poetry. So I think that, that's part of what I appreciated here. This poem was, I liked that it was spare. I liked that it was crisp, and it was not, there was like, if there was a vice in these poems, it was a good vice, which was just lush description. Just a lot of enumeration of specific physical topography, indoors or outdoors. And this one was had kind of slightly sparer description, which I tend to favor. It's called Anchorage, and the title presumably, suggests Anchorage is a city, right? Yeah, Anchorage is a city in Alaska, or town. So I assume that the title refers both to a location and to a process of finding an anchor. Maybe even in the Zapfaian sense, right? In that, is it Peter Zapfa, the guy who wrote The Last Messiah? I think anchoring was one of his methods for avoiding the fear of death. You tie yourself to an important source of meaning, which is, I think, maybe partly what's happening in this poem. All right, so this is Anchorage by Wayne Miller. Nights awake in my father's house, his passed out snoring down the hall, his new wife having left again for a hotel, the world sealed in snow. To love him and still want to be lifted from there, to want to leave and leave no footprints, and also the curious wish that someone might be awake in a window watching me. This was, I now realize, a first longing to be read, though I had no interest then in poetry, which can say, "Child, you will be lifted from that room. You can see yourself from every window." So he's talking about a childhood experience that sounds sad, troubling, wanting to escape a life that he could not escape in childhood. But then it becomes a moment of epiphany in which he sort of realizes, that is, he realizes in retrospect that he was discovering in himself a desire to be read, a longing to be read. So what really caught my attention in this poem is that I think it is a curious distinction worth making. It's not one I'd thought about in quite these terms, but I definitely recognize it now. The longing to be read is a real thing. I mean, it's a real longing. It's a real source of, we do tend to want there to be somebody paying attention to us. We want to matter. We want to be recorded in the book of life. I think I didn't have precisely this desire when I was a child, but I think that's not because I was, less self-absorbed than this person was. It's really just because I believed in God. Like I believe that God was already watching me from the window. I believe that sort of I was being observed and my behavior was being recorded, and that there was an active and invested audience to my daily life. And so then the desire to write came not from the desire to be read. I mean, it did certainly have to do with readers, but it was less a desire to be read than to do something to readers, to do the thing that was done to me when I read things that I liked. And, starting when I was, things I wrote, maybe affected or got some people's attention, I wanted to produce that effect on people. Make them gasp, make them surprised, make them accuse me of plagiarism, which I know Shashi was very offended by, but I was flattered by, even at the time. Yeah, but this strikes me like this was, Miller says, I'm attributing this to Miller, but you could say this is the speaker. This was, I now realize, a first longing to be read, though I had no interest then in poetry, which can say, right? Poetry which can say. So he's now shifting from the past to the present, right? He's no longer saying that this this childlike desire to have somebody watching through the window was the first longing to be read. He's now saying in the present of poetry that poetry can say, child, you will be lifted from that room. You can see yourself from every window. And I guess that's true. Poetry can say that, in that you could write poetry, and in the writing of it you could sort of savor the viewing of yourself through the windows of the house. This seems to me, from an adult perspective, to be like a really wrong-headed approach to poetry, and one that doesn't lead to good writing for the most part. I found this poem to be clear, to be very human. It was, it didn't bore me. I wanted to read it beginning to end. It was a voice I found congenial, if not always, mesmerizing. It's like, this was, I think, a perfectly effective little piece of poetic speech. It did remind me, though, the argument in it, that poetry can say, child, you will be lifted from that room. You can see yourself from every window. What that argument really reminded me of was a couple of books I started and have not yet finished recently. They were like very well-received books from very fancy presses. Presses I would love. I mean, I love Measure. Measure's wonderful. But, these were books from prestige presses that do a very nice job with their in-house design and, book quality. They're beautiful objects. The list of publications were formidable. The blurbs were no blurbs, of course, could be more formidable than mine, and all of the people who were kind enough to provide them for me. I am very grateful and touched. But these were like big shot books of poetry, and I found, opening them and then reading the first few poems, I just thought, oh God, what a drag! I can't believe there's so much more to read of this. That was my thought. I was and even picking them up for a second sitting, I was kind of discouraged after a few pages in both cases. And then I came back and all right, let me dig back in and start reading it. And again, I thought, oh man, there's going to be a lot of work getting through this. Fuck. It's so dry. It's it's not, in one case it was had a little bit more of an historical bent. I was texting with Alice today, and I realized, I was trying to identify the literary equivalent of fruitcake. Fruitcake is a punchline, but my mom made fruitcake growing up because for her dad, who loved it, and she, as a devoted daughter, would go through the considerable work of producing a slab of fruitcake every Christmas. I mean, just inedible, awful stuff. Fruitcake, literally. There are cases where a fruitcake has been preserved for 100 years and is still edible. It's a terrible food nobody should ever eat. It's this block of over-sweetened alcoholic bread crammed with candied fruits. I mean, it's just for those who don't like fruits in their pastries, it's a nightmare. For those who do like fruits in their pastries, it's a nightmare because they're candied. I mean, it's horrible. And it is like a brick. I mean, pound cake is like a flaky, delicate croissant compared to fruitcake. Fruitcake is the worst. And with Alice, I was trying to think, what is the literary equivalent of fruitcake? A description of, if you're told, oh, we're going to have dessert, and then someone produces fruitcake, you have that sinking feeling, particularly if you know that you have to eat some. What is the literary equivalent of that? And I thought, the literary equivalent of fruitcake is heavily researched prose poetry. If you're told, oh, we're going to have we're going to have a little quick reading. We're going to have a little read. We're going to enjoy. There's something I'd like you to read. Oh, you'd like me to read something? What is it? It's heavily researched prose poetry. It's just you just have that fuck, I gotta eat this. This is going to be a labor. So I think one of the books was heavily researched prose poetry. And and it felt that way. I mean, I haven't finished it. I haven't finished it because I didn't have it in me yet. I'm sure I will at some point. And the other one was versified, but it just felt like this like smart, talented, slightly too celebrated poet, just writing out his thoughts, just thinking some thoughts and writing them down, and like. God bless him. I mean, truly, God bless him. I'm glad they have the posts they have, and the I don't begrudge poets any gig or money or sinecure they can get. Like if you can get a sinecure, if you can get a hookup as a poet, get it. Go for it. Don't apologize. But like, it actually made me mad when I thought about these books. Like I felt that way because I was listening to a podcast called Blocked and Reported that is usually, I think it is, their self-description is that they're a podcast about stupid internet bullshit. And it tends to be both sort of entertaining and provocative. And I often disagree with them on some political questions, but they're like usually sort of smart and well-researched. They brought in somebody, Lee Stein, who's a writer, to talk about a poetry controversy. I may mention the controversy in a little bit. I may look into it. It was, she did a fine job. It was the thing Brian talks about where like, if somebody speaks publicly about a topic a lot about, then you just notice all the things they get wrong. And that sort of, you get driven crazy by feeling like, oh God, this person's so underqualified to talk about this. And so she did a perfectly fine job. It was just, I was annoyed because she didn't quite know what she was talking about. Listening to the two of them, neither of them being poets, both of them being successful, celebrated prose writers, listening to them talk about how dumb and self-congratulatory poetry is, I thought, like, go fuck yourself. And then I also simultaneously thought of these two books I'd read. I thought, like, God damn it. Like, you're making us look so bad, guys. Like, you are doing all the things that they say we do. Like, stop. And reading this poem, which again, I think like it's a pretty good poem. And like it conveys its thought a lot more crisply and a lot more memorably than either of these other books did in many pages that I read from each of them. It's short, so I'll read it one more time very quickly. Anchorage by Wayne Miller. Nights awake in my father's house, his passed out snoring down the hall, his new wife having left again for a hotel, the world sealed in snow. That's a lot of that's a bleak situation laid out very calmly without really any dwelling on the emotion, just identifying specific details that paint a picture. Nights awake in my father's house, his passed out snoring down the hall, his new wife having left again for a hotel, the world sealed in snow. To love him and still want to be lifted from there. To want to leave and leave no footprints. Right? To leave and not be followed, not leave a trace someone could follow. And also the curious wish that someone might be awake in a window watching me. This was, I now realize, a first longing to be read, though I had no interest then in poetry, which can say, child, you will be lifted from that room. You can see yourself from every window. Yeah, I mean, so this child in the poem is incredibly sympathetic, right? And as a childlike wish, it just is really perfectly recognizable, perfectly touching. It's the translation of this into an adult wish, which he does. I mean, it's that really the little phrase that catches me is the poetry which can say, which I guess poetry which can say, is that a clause? I don't actually know grammar. I shouldn't pretend to teach grammar on my podcast. But I think the suggestion that like poetry can say to people writing poetry now, child, you will be lifted from that room. You can see yourself from every window. Like, I feel like that's what poetry said to the two people who wrote these celebrated bad books. Like they were writing these books saying to themselves, look, I can see myself from every window. What they weren't saying is, I hope I have enough. I would love to have an effect on the reader by writing this. They're not even really thinking about writing. They're thinking about being read, having somebody pay attention to them, and it feels like that. It feels like, well, since it's a given that you're going to be paying attention to me, here are the little thoughts that are passing through my mind at this moment. Here's an interesting project I've been working on, some heavily researched prose poetry. Again, I think like that poem is a pretty good poem that identifies a horrible problem with contemporary poetry, though it is not, I think, an example of poetry, the poetry that the sort of worst, it succumbs in the worst way to that temptation. Then there were two poems that I thought did similar things, and both did them pretty well. They're not always my favorite things that poems can do, but I think what they don't do is take the reader's attention or interest for granted. They do bother to try to entertain the reader. When I checked into the hotel tonight, the clerk at the desk asked me what I was doing in town, and I said I was here for a reading, and she said, "Oh, like spoken word?" And I said, "Well, poetry, but do you like spoken word? Do you listen to spoken word?" She said, "Yeah, I do." And I said, "Who do you like?" And she said, honestly, I don't really have a person, but like when I see it, I like it." And I thought, like, okay, well that makes sense to me. Again, spoken word is not my favorite, but when you go to a spoken word show, they don't take the reader's attention for granted. And neither did these two poems I wanted to look at real quick. I won't spend a lot of time on them. This is Stephanie Staub. The poem is called Safety Coffin. In a dream, my father comes back from the dead, furious that we held a funeral. Resurrected in the kitchen, fuming, how could you imagine I would die? My mother had buried him in a maroon sweatsuit from his beloved alma mater. So he'll be comfy lying in there, she said, mollified, even in death. In the back seat of the car, my brother gently explains to his young son, after Papo passed away, we put his body in a box called a casket and buried it in the cemetery. My nephew panicked. Okay, but what did you do with his head? In an attempt at mourning, I read books about mortality and learn that in the 1800s, a society called the Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial invented something called a safety coffin. It was fitted with a little rope inside that the dead person could pull to ring a bell up on earth to say they'd been buried alive. A strange reassurance. An icy ease. A trick he taught me. If you tell someone that you are going to pour boiling water on her hand, but instead you pour freezing cold water, she'll scream as if you've burned her. The mind does the suffering for you. So this is written in prose paragraphs, but they're fairly slender paragraphs, so it doesn't have that heart sinking. It doesn't produce the heart sinking sensation of like seeing a block of prose suddenly when you're expecting verse. It's written in a very clear, fresh, conversational way. I think it's well done. It's all hand stitched, and I found it engrossing, entertaining. Like I enjoyed reading these sentences, and then I wanted to see what the next sentence was going to be, or the next paragraph was going to be. It's broken into those 4 sections. You can kind of hear, I hope, by the way I read it. But this was, I think, a very clear example of a subtype of poem that I have previously referred to as the Woe Neat Fact Man poem. Matthew Oldsman is a big writer of Woe Neat Fact Man poems, and they can be fun, like they can be cool, they can be moving, But what occurred to me reading this one was that you can tell if what you are reading is a Woe Neat Fact Man poem if you already know one of the facts. like I already knew about safety coffins, and so then reading this like, hey, did you know about safety coffins? Whoa, neat fact, man. reading that paragraph in this poem, I thought, yeah, I know. I've heard about it. And then her sort of her concluding commentary on it, a strange reassurance, an icy ease. It's not, it's fine. It's a way to kind of close the paragraph, to button the suit, but it doesn't, it doesn't transform anything. It's just a way to present a neat fact. And then the final fact, which I did not know, if you tell someone that you are going to pour boiling water on her hand, but instead you pour freezing cold water, she'll scream as if you've burned her. That, like, what a cool, weird, interesting thing. And as I read it, I could imagine it happening to me, and I could imagine that reflexive pain and fear that I would experience even as I realized, like, oh, this isn't hot water. And then she similarly concludes, the mind does the suffering for you. It's a little sort of it's almost like a placebo closing sentence. It doesn't really say very much. It certainly doesn't transform what you've just heard. But if what you've just heard is new to you, it feels very satisfying, right? And reading this felt satisfying. And again, Whoa Neat Fact Man poems are not bad poems. It's just a way to get and hold the reader's attention. I think it is a somewhat limited way, and I think they tend to suffer pretty severely on rereading. But it's a well done instance of its type. The other poem in here that I thought was basically a Whoa Neat Fact Man poem, with maybe a slight, maybe it has a little more to it than that. This was written in verse, meaning that on the page the lines were broken. I thought this basically could have been broken into prose the same, or presented as prose the same as the Stephanie Staub poem. So this is More Human by Zoe Mays. I'm sorry, I just couldn't read the phrase More Human without hearing the opening guitar riff of More Human Than Human by White Zombie. It's just an artifact of the age I grew up in. So this is Zoe Mays' More Human. How relieving to realize a word can mean itself and its opposite. That sanction can both approve and penalize. That homely is both ugly and cozy. So it's not beauty that comforts us, but unsightliness. Clunky passes made on rotten couches, wiping the sweat that sticks beneath our tits, flipping off cars that nearly kill us as we try to cross the street. Who wants a straight meaning? More human, that cleave both clings and sunders. And what of the oldest woman who ever lived? How some claim she's a fraud, that her daughter assumed her identity after death. Imagine that disqualifying, as if one woman can't be two women, or that two women can't live one life. So this, I think, is also basically a Whoa Neat Fact Man poem. Most of it is made up of like cool instances she found of words that can mean themselves and their opposite. Sanction, homely, cleave, and then this final neat fact, the oldest woman who ever lived, who is, some claim she's a fraud because it may have been her daughter pretending to be her after she died. And then they're sort of combining the second part of her life with her mother's. I think in this case, she elaborates on the neat facts a little more than Staub does, and maybe adds a little more to them. I think she certainly transforms that final fact a little more, where there's sort of a counterintuitive defense attorney interpretation. Imagine that disqualifying. So what if it was her daughter and not her identifying as with herself? As if one woman can't be two women, or that two women can't live one life. And in that way, I think she does suggest something a little bit beyond just the circumstances of the facts as presented, right? There is something maybe a little more universal in the suggestion that, like, oh, we do sometimes find ourselves repeating the lives of those who came before us, certainly our parents. And in that way, like, I realized that much more touching, finally, than the meditation on cold and freezing water or the safety coffin was the beginning of that last paragraph, which I missed the first time, which was a trick he taught me. Right. The final paragraph is, this is a fact she learned from him. that what this fact, maybe this reflects something about the mind suffering, in an absence, or suffering in the when it's when it expects something rather than when something is actually present. But also the framing of the whole fact is simply, I learned it from him. So those were the Woe Neat Fact Man poems in this issue. And then there was one I quite... So I'll say this. I recognized a lot of the names. Not a lot of the names, actually. There were some that were... Most of the names were brand new. Let's see. I'll just read through them. This is the table of contents. Most of what we actually do when we get an issue of poetry, for the most part, is we just read through the table of contents. So Shara Leslie, Stephanie Staub has 2 poems. Mark Kraushar, Bruce Beasley has 2 poems. Haley Lighthouser has 3 poems. Jeremy Rodden... Dan Albergotti, Tara A. Elliott, Julie Hansen, Matthew Wimberly, Bob Hickok, Steve Castro, Jeffrey Brock, Zoe Mays, Carolyn Oros, Elizabeth Metzger, Christopher Nelson, Anne Barngrover has 2 poems. Austin Segrest, Will Cordero has 2 poems. Amit Majmudar has 2 poems. Wayne Miller has 2 poems. Dawn Manning has a poem. So most of those were new names to me, and there were certainly a handful I recognized. Probably the best known in there were Bruce Beasley and Bob Hickok. Well, and I'm gonna get to Amit in a minute, but so what I noticed was this probably this is evidence of bias. But what I found was, in reading through it, I didn't like the poems of the better known people better than the poems of the lesser known people. Like, that was not like, I was just as likely to like a poem whether or not the name of the person was recognizable to me, like whether or not I'd seen it on a lot of other tables of contents, or I'd never seen it before. That didn't seem to make a difference to my enjoyment. But the 2 poets who wrote the poems I enjoyed most were the 2 poets I know personally. Which, like, initially that just suggests, like, oh, I'm just liking the poems of people I like. Like, that seems very, very likely. Like, that seems certainly to be like the Occam's razor explanation. The other possibility, at least, that came to mind, though, is that in this case, both of the 2 poets in question are people I got to know personally only after I got to know their work. And I liked their work. So, like, they were good writers, and then I got to know them as people. So there are other people in here I have met, or certainly have read their work before, and seen their names before, but I haven't been drawn or driven to go to seek them out, or to look them up, or to reach out to them. And, vice versa. And the stars haven't aligned. So again, I think mostly what that suggests is just bias. But I did think that, like, the 2 poems, or the work of the 2 poets that most interested me were the work of Haley Lighthouser and Amit Majmudar. Haley has a few poems. I mean, her poems are always just like she is definitely somebody who likes her language taut and springy, and she's a very interesting, like, I don't think of her as being like an especially sexy or erotic poet, but she is definitely a sensuous. There's sensual and sensuous, and I always forget. One of those means sexual, basically, and one of them just means having to do with the senses. Yeah, so sensual, American Heritage is calling relating to or involving gratification of the senses, and physical, especially sexual pleasure, and sensuous, relating to the senses rather than the intellect. I mean, I think Haley's poems are sensual in that they are, like, they're sensuous, they're concerned with the senses, and certainly, like, language is a source of direct sensory experience for her. But they're also concerned with, like, physical pleasure, even if they don't feel like erotic poems. I mean, she certainly does have some erotic poems, but like, they always feel like poems written by somebody who like really likes to speak and hear and listen to the language, and who also has a body, like, has a real body in the world. Here's one. This is like a classic Haley Lighthouser poem. This was not my favorite of the ones in this issue, but this is one that's, like, I think very representative of her. Like, she's perfectly content just enjoying language and doing nothing else sometimes. Like, that's perfect. Like, if she enjoys it, if she enjoys the language, like, she's often content with that alone. And I think this is actually kind of a perfect, like, a poem that kind of enacts itself, or at least enacts a good allegory for itself. This is called The One Who Ate the Sugar. The one who ate the sugar, this is by Haley Lighthouser. The one who ate the sugar ate the syrup, ate the cobbler and the cake. The one who licked the sugar, licked the batter, licked the butter from the spoon, stole the twilight, stole the starlight, stole the porch light, stole the moon. End of poem. That's it. Just like, she's just scooping up some sugar and just enjoying herself and moving on. But the poem I liked of her, best of her three, is called Where I Live. And it reminded me in form of Kay Ryan, in that they're very short lines, little sort of micro, not couplets, but little 2-line stanzas, often just a word or two per line, and with a buried rhyme scheme, as Kay Ryan's poems often have, and in like a pretty clear grammatical structure. Like they're not just words floating around with some rhymes thrown in. They actually are. This is a perfectly well constructed sentence, all told. It also, though, as an argument, it reminded me a lot of an Elizabeth Bishop poem called Insomnia, which I'm not going to read right now, but it I believe it's where there was a big record by the Shins when I was in college that they had some songs that were in a bunch of movies called "Oh Inverted World," and I believe it's from that poem, "The World Inverted." Is a phrase that appears in the last stanza of that poem, but basically that poem is a reverse Priamel, and this poem has a similar kind of rhetorical structure to it. So this is Where I Live by Haley Lighthouser, and the title moves into the poem. Where I'd live, bells are hourly unrung, holes undug, bee stings unstung, toothpaste slips back in its tube, lips unkiss, sands unshift, the sun unsets, days undawn, and all that up and goes is not gone. A little bit of like Kevin Young with that kind of use of the colloquial there. All that up and goes, and because the lines are broken up, the lines in the stanzas are broken up so into such tiny little morsels, it does kind of begins to produce like a slightly surreal effect. Like the words begin to atomize, or the sentences begin to atomize. And it is like it's such a delicate little sliver of a poem, and it buries all of its longing, all of the wish in this wish fulfillment poem is buried in an apostrophe in the title, where I'd live, where I would live, and that's would in the sense of the old, like the slightly older sense, like where would is the subjunctive form of will, just as should is the subjunctive form of shall. So there's a great little weird medieval poem that begins, I can't remember how it begins, but the line that I love in it is, the Bailey beareth the bell away, the lily the rose I lay. It's about a girl who's getting married and who's sort of realizes like, not sure how I feel about this. But she has a great, there's a line where she says, and I had all I would, meaning like I possessed all that I willed to have, that I wanted. And that same willed, wanted, subjunctive will is slipped into the apostrophe in the title, where I'd live, bells are hourly unrung, holes undug, bee stings unstung, toothpaste slips back in its tube, lips unkiss, sands unshift, the sun unsets, days undawn, and all that up and goes is not gone. It's sort of barely anything, but it's it's what Greg Williamson when somebody wrote like a very short poem that kind of got away with more than it ought to. He liked to say it's the stone that slays the giant. All right. So then I did really like Amit's poems in here. He has two. One is called Apollinian, which I kind of appreciated because that was the form of the word that's usually called Apollonian. Apollinian is the form of that adjective that appeared in the original translation I read of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, which is exactly what he's writing about, or rather, he's taking his dichotomy from that book, the Apollinian versus the Dionysiac, or sometimes it's called in other translations, the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. This is a prose poem, but in typical show-off Amit fashion. It's not really a prose poem. If you read it, it's the 3-beat line, the 3-beat feet are so audible that when he mentions hexameter in here, and this would be dactylic hexameter, I haven't bothered to try to re-break the lines and turn it into verse, but I assume that he probably wrote this in something like dactylic hexameter. I mean, dactylic hexameter, at least as the ancients treated it, admitted of a lot of substitutions, kind of the way that iambic pentameter does. So the trouble is that once you unbreak those lines into paragraphs, I would say it is like a little tricky to re-break them if you don't have rhymes or something else to work with as signposts. He did, infamously do an interview with poor Caitlin Doyle, a prose interview in paragraphs for Literary Matters with long-suffering Caitlin Doyle, brilliant poet in her own right, in which he, like a dick, answered all the questions in rhyming verse, but just wrote them out in paragraphs. Amit Majumdar. I told him in Newburyport that I was originally going to be giving his intro, and if I had given it, the first line of my intro would have been "Fuck you, Amit Majumdar." But he knows. But yeah, it's I think it's a really cool poem, this weird fake prose poem, dactylic hexameter poem about Apollo, in which he kind of contrasts Apollo with the sun. As I think later, the Greeks very much distinguished Apollo, the god of things, from the god that was things. There was the god of the sun, and then there was the sun himself, Helios. I think it's Helios whose chariot Phaeton steals, though Shane would know for sure because that was in the title of his fucking book, his memoir. The horses that pull the chariot of the... Fuck, damn it. Sorry, Shane. Sorry. Go buy Shane's books. But yeah, but Apollo is very associated with the sun, and in in Nietzsche's vision, Apollo is the god of order, and Dionysus is the god of instinct and chaos, and the two of them hold each other in tension. And Amit basically just entertains himself by making a case for the sun as a source of chaos and madness and horror and entropy. Entropy is the word I'm reaching for. It is. I slept a little bit on the train up here, but those seat backs do not go back. Did not sleep great. I had a lot of weird sitting up, bobbling over dreams. But the poem of his I really, really loved is called Patronage, and it is I think he does a good job here of writing I have written a few poems that I think of as basically just being exercises in rhetoric, where I tried to versify an argument and make it entertaining, but really I'm just sort of venting some thoughts on a subject and putting it into verse and trying to make it fun to listen to, but I don't know beyond that it's really got much merit as a poem. I think he could limit himself to doing that here, but I think he allows the conceit to run away with him a little bit so that he doesn't get stuck just wagging a finger or making an argument. He kind of allows himself fully to get immersed in the implications of the argument. So this is a really delightful poem, basically wishing for the worst of the old world so that we could at least so that at least like writers could be treated like fucking writers, and not like gig economy, sharing economy stooges, or worse, people applying for academic jobs. So I just thought like this is like a fun spleen venting poem with like also like a lot of really wonderful rich language in it. So this is called Patronage by Amit Majumdar. Oh, for the days of assassin dispatching, cousin poisoning Renaissance dukes with an ear for beauty in ottava rima, of big spending cutthroat Borgias in papal regalia, willing to lavish blood-slick ducats on the fine arts, kings with rotten teeth, who hanged pickpockets from bridges, but paid their pet playwrights a living wage. Sherbet-sipping sultans, who shuttled between the harem and the mehfil. Oh, for my very own surveillance state Caesar Augustus, asking only that every so often a stanza liken him to Jove. Oh, for a dissolute aesthetic pasha, or a Medici who gets me, or some Rilkean widow offering a rent-free seaside castle. Anything but this committee of rivals and fossils, unpublishable judges with grudges in a coffee conclave, glancing at my heart like a passport handed over at heaven's border. Snug mediocrities with slovenly offices, deciding whether I am fit to have a future here. The light from my unwritten books still light years in the distance reaching me for now, though there's no way to tell if they've blinked out already, making way for the tenured night. That last stanza, I think, really like gives it a shot at being like a poem that's a real poem and not just a delicious rant. Snug mediocrities, like the unpublishable judges with grudges, this committee of rivals and fossils. It has a little. It sort of has the general shape of a sonnet, but he had too much fun to limit himself to 14 lines, and you get the big obscene, decadent, disgusting, wonderful bad old days, and then the in the second portion the pseudo sestet, which is itself an octave, I think. You get the dry, joyless, bureaucratic real world. It reminds me of the line in Terence Winch's Sex Elegy when he says the past is I can tell I'm tired because I should have this by heart. Yeah, he says the present is the life insurance premium automatically deducted from your paycheck, while the past burns out of control in a vacant lot on the outskirts of town. That's Terence Winch's Sex Elegy. And yeah, I thought like this was like a really rich. This reminded me of that. But then I think he also like it's with that final phrase, the tenured night, which brings to mind the phrase in Shakespeare's, is it 29 or 30? The death state. Oh, I think it's 30. Death stateless night. Yeah, like there's something about that, the longing for acceptance by the academics and then the inevitable absolute tenure of night that's coming either way, regardless of who reads your poems, who likes them. Yeah, I just thought like it was such a fun poem, and it managed to be like it was like if he just sat down deciding to like fully indulge all of his like it's like annoyance with the contemporary poetry world. Just that was like more than enough. It was like a total delight. And then I think he manages to do a little more than that. Like I think he manages to get a little more out of the concept than just that. I just thought this was like a really, really good piece of work. I'll read it one more time. Why not? This is my fucking podcast. This is Patronage by Amit Majumdar. Oh, for the days of assassin dispatching, cousin poisoning Renaissance dukes with an ear for beauty in ottava rima, of big spending cutthroat Borgias in papal regalia, willing to lavish blood-slick ducats on the fine arts, kings with rotten teeth who hanged pickpockets from bridges but paid their pet playwrights a living wage, sherbet-sipping sultans who shuttled between the harem and the mehfil. Oh, for my very own surveillance state Caesar Augustus, asking only that every so often a stanza liken him to Jove. Oh, for a dissolute aesthetic pasha, or a Medici who gets me, or some Rilkean widow offering a rent-free seaside castle. Anything but this committee of rivals and fossils. Unpublishable judges with grudges in a coffee conclave glancing at my heart like a passport handed over at heaven's border. Snug mediocrities with slovenly offices deciding whether I am fit to have a future here. The light from my unwritten books still light years in the distance, reaching me for now, though there's no way to tell if they've blinked out already, making way for the tenured night. Oh, that was quite good. And I should say, like, in addition to providing a little look at a survey of the landscape, I think part of what a good poetry magazine does is it also sort of stirs the soil and reminds you of other things. It brings you back to old poems you like, which this issue did at several points, including this final poem I'll read. I think probably the most accomplished poems in here were Haley's and Amit's. This one I think is flawed, but I did really, really enjoy it. This is called Rec League by Will Cordero. And it's a kind of a simple premise. This is a very Brian poem premise, although sorry, Brian, you're having to listen to so much poetry in this episode. So he's describing a 40 and over basketball league. So like a YMCA league, rec league, for middle-aged men way past their basketball prime years who nonetheless, play hard and enjoy what they're doing. And he's describing it with the jargon and slang and taut action forward construction of like a radio play-by-play. Like he's describing it as if this is an NBA championship game, but with the realities of rec league basketball. So like that's like I think in itself sort of like a fun premise. I do think it then turns into a little more than that. So this is Rec League by Will Cordero. Old heads huffing as the clock counts down for 40 and olders. Sneakers squeak and scuffle. Bad backs and creaky knees. Working stiffs all toiling for a board, shoving elbows if not boxing out to snatch a brick that smacks against the bracket. A podiatrist dribbles left, crosses up the short order cook, then sends a pocket pass to the backdoor cutter who jump stops, lifts, and rockets to the cup, but collides with a former jock who runs the taco joint downtown. Such disjointed slabs and flabs of flesh, ankle braces, sweatbands, and too tight shorts. The taco jock gets cocky and launches a step back three that airballs in the bleachers. Thanks his bum wrist for his bad aim. The big man who works the lumberyard lumbers, reaches for the rock, then overheads an outlet for a racing 2-on-1 fast break. Tech support fakes a skip pass, pauses, slips his hips to jab step crabwise round the ad guy frozen to the hardwood, and he can't back out, rises to the hole. The whole gym holds its breath. He flicks a loose-limbed finger roll, one feathery scoop, while falling down. Dark leather kisses glass, deflecting off the rim. He tumbles over, bruising ribs. The ball, back-spinning, rattles, waits before caressing net. It's not winning, but the piquant effort that makes this battle with our bodies finally, fatally beautiful. I really enjoyed it, and I think like part of what it does is allow for, like what is exciting. We watched the Duke UNC game, the second Duke UNC game at Duke. The UNC won both of them. It was a good, the second one in particular was like a really exciting game. Joanna was gloating nonstop throughout, just insufferable. Nobody in our house went to Duke, but to Joanna, you would have thought we all went to Duke. Joanna was just victory dancing on all of us. But what's exciting is getting to see human beings do unbelievable things with their bodies, and of course, like 40-plus-year-old guys playing at a YMCA are not doing the things that the top college basketball teams in the U.S. are doing, but nonetheless, he kind of manages to arrive at a moment of physical awe at the end, where this tech support guy pulls off this kind of gorgeous layup. I think it's a lay. I don't know. I don't play basketball, Brian. I told you I'm a failure as a man. And it is like a moment of real physical beauty. The whole gym holds its breath. He flicks a loose-limbed finger roll, one feathery scoop while falling down. Like it is a moment of real grace, and like collective experience, collective awe. I Jonathan always tells me like not to criticize poems that I read on here when I'm calling attention to them. I don't want to. Yeah, like that's fair. I've like questions about the ending, but I think like this was one I totally enjoyed reading. Definitely would have published this if this came in the slush pile. It's like this is like a poem that's like fun to read. It's worth reading. It's like making some choices that are kind of interesting. Yeah, like so all of the things that can't be said about those two famous people books I was reading the other day. Like this is exactly what a poetry magazine should be doing throughout, right? Like even the poems in here I didn't like, I thought like, okay, all right, like you're doing some things. Like you this is like I don't know what David, like I don't know, I couldn't pick out his favorite poem in here. But like I understood the kind of choices he's making, which is like, hey, this is like worth doing. Maybe not all these poems are equally original. Maybe not all of them are equally polished. But like they have things worth paying attention to in here. And like that's not so on offer. That's not so abundant that that's like an easy thing to do. I do think that like part of what allows them to like do a pretty good job is that they only do 2 of these a year. So they publish 64 poems a year. And like maybe that's about right. Like maybe that's about the right amount to set out to publish so that you feel like you can pretty confidently say like, yeah, you're going to find something worth your time in here. I will finally, just because that initial 32 poems rumor about the closed shop came from grad school, that poem, that last Will Cardera poem about the rec league sent me back to a poem I really fell in love with in graduate school and had not read in years, and came back to it and I thought like, fuck, this is good. So this is another basketball poem, another middle-aged guys playing basketball poem by Dave Smith, who is the chair of my of the writing seminars when I was there in grad school. And he was, as I've talked about this on the podcast before, like he was kind of a prick to me. Like he was not kind of a prick. He was a real prick to me. Like I don't like him personally. I didn't like him at the time. I haven't talked to him since then. I don't have like bad blood, but like I really didn't like him as a person, but like he was a real deal poet. I mean, he is alive. He is a poet. I haven't read his stuff recently, but like he wrote some like really moving poems, and this is probably my favorite. I haven't spent as much time with his work as like Ryan has. I mean, Ryan would be able to give a much better accounting of his work. I've read some of his criticism and a lot of his poems. This is probably my favorite, and it's partly my favorite because it's in memory of William Matthews, who's one of these poets. Like William Matthews was in his day, he was very successful. He was very celebrated. He taught at Yale, I think, and he won the Yale Younger Poets. I don't know if he taught at Yale, but he taught at like fancy places. He was hot shit in the poetry world, and he's basically vanished since then. He was as you hear in the book, he was a big drinker, big smoker, huge womanizer. Not a great guy. Like his son's memoir, Sebastian Matthews. I think it's Sebastian Matthews. His son's memoir of growing up with him is really good. I think it may just be called My Father's Footsteps, something kind of bland like that. But William Matthews does not come off great in that story. Like Dave talked about reading it and being horrified at his friend's behavior, even having known him personally. But this is a poem in memory of him. And so even though I don't really read William Matthews' poetry much anymore, and when I've gone back to it, I think it probably doesn't date very well. He has a poem called the Bar at the Andover Inn that I think I like. But a lot of his poems feel a little bit like kind of cheap tricks. But this is a poem about him, about being friends with him and loving him, and envying him and kind of hating him at times as a fellow poet and as a basketball player, because apparently William Matthews was a real dick as a basketball player. And that's partly what this poem is about. He then, he talks about, so he mentions Plumlee. He mentions a few different people, but Plumlee was a contemporary of theirs, Stanley Plumlee. And he talks about playing basketball with him, and he talks about watching him write poems or kind of soar through his poetry career. And then he ends with this photograph of them playing basketball, and Matthews is doing exactly the thing that Will Cordero describes, which is pulling off a shot as he's falling down. And that's the title. The title is Coming Down in Ohio. So William Matthews was, I believe, an Ohio poet, or at least that's where this poem takes place, or this photo takes place. Coming Down in Ohio by Dave Smith. My uniform hung Air Force blue, way uncool, when we first met. But Italian silks fit you sleek as a summer shower. Tall and thin, galoises. I know in French you don't pronounce the S at the end of a plural, but this is French cigarettes in English, so I'm going to say galoises. All right, I'll start over. Basically, like, in the beginning, Dave is describing himself as being a square, and William Matthews as being just endlessly slick. So this is Coming Down in Ohio by Dave Smith, in memoriam, William Matthews. My uniform hung Air Force blue, way uncool, when we first met. But Italian silks fit you sleek as a summer shower. Tall and thin, galoises, Yale swagger, you were the rule exceptions were made to break. Years unkind, to say the least, wiped out that grin I still see when you lounged like Rimbaud, Maudit. Blonde coeds drooled and took notes. You quoted Horace, charmed us, sipped Chablis like gospel, cooed over Monk, bloomed in smoke, killing Hugo and Wright, lungs gone black. 30-some, you sagged by noon. The slack red set of your eyes, stride gimpy, stiff, exactly what you'd lived to enact. A boy poet, rich as Dickens, keel-hauled by life. The more you age, the more booze, pills, crunch of poets got you. No jazz played too much or kept the night glooms off. You loved one woman for looks, one art, one touch, as cool as grace you envied and easily took on. You praised long fingers, NBA centers, pianists, both ranked only just lower than trumpets. You played some yourself. Slow forward, I recalled, and argued game as well as any theorist. Watch his elbows, Plumlee groaned. I'd been warned. And still you swiped my ball and nicked my face enough to let me know the penalty of place applies anywhere we play with lines exactly. The last time I saw you laced up shoes, chair-bound, breathless, sweating in sun. Then you died. I took it hard. Gone the you friends and I had read, and would half be, half tunes half heard, the slick, easy heartbeat whose dribble and leap was smoothly you. But memory knows who you were on the concrete. Maybe that's why I can't read unguarded elegies where, almost, you walk on water. Silly. This part I particularly like. It's just, he stops the elegy to say, he read elegies about him in which they were just sappy. It was just praise. It was just hagiography. Just, you were the best. You were great. And like, he wasn't great. He was pretty shitty often, and maybe like most of the time. But he was still Dave's friend. Dave still loved him. So he's writing this other kind of elegy. I'll go back a little bit. Then you died. I took it hard. Gone the you friends and I had read, and would half be, half tunes, half heard. The slick, easy heartbeat whose dribble and leap was smoothly you. But memory knows who you were on the concrete. Maybe that's why I can't read unguarded elegies where almost you walk on water. Silly. I'm in a photo with you rising for a layup. Your hand seems at the rim. Beneath your feet there's only air. The slab. Nothing to disrupt what looks, given this angle, perfect and casual. Just the way you liked things. Dusk, marginal as a zone, holds the rest of us stunned. See, our mouths are open as if we sing choral tributes as you rise, sexy star, razor quick, alone. Understanding how hurt scores, you always clowned, as here you grin, float, beating our shouts, time's up! The photos pale, but your looks locked past the ball as down your body comes among us who cry foul, most foul. Yeah, I think that's quite good. And it is written, Dave had like great animosity toward formal poetry. He really, really was hard on people for writing in form often. But this poem is in a kind of form. And he had a crunchy knuckle cracking sense of meter when he used it. But this is this is little 5-line stanzas that do rhyme, loosely, but regularly. A, B, yeah, A, B, A, B. I think that's what he's doing. I mean, it's real loose at times, but yeah, I think he's A, B, A, B. A little off kilter. Is he using a short middle line, or is he just real free with his counting? I don't know, but yeah, I quite like that. I'm in a photo with you rising for a layup. Your hand seems at the rim. Beneath your feet there's only air, the slab, nothing to disrupt what looks, given this angle, perfect and casual, just the way you liked things. Dusk, marginal as a zone, holds the rest of us stunned. See, our mouths are open as if we sing choral tributes as you rise, sexy star, razor quick, alone. Understanding how hurt scores, you always clowned. As here you grin, float, beating our shouts, time's up! The photos pale, but your looks locked past the ball as down your body comes among us who cry foul, most foul. Yeah, and I think he does a pretty good job here of, I think, balancing like a very clear-eyed view of the reality of this guy's life with fairly talky register and pace, and then that little elevation of register at the end, that little flight that's almost Elizabethan, as down your body comes among us who cry foul, most foul. So yeah, that I was grateful to the Will Cordero poem for among other things sending me back to that Dave Smith poem. But yeah, good issue. Good job, David. Good job, Elizabeth. Good job, guys. I don't know. I was gonna threaten them somehow. I'm not sure what I would threaten them with. Keep it up. And no, this is not a paid advertisement. But hey, there. I think if I think of people I would not feel ill having sponsored the show, it'd be 32 poems would be in there. Chess.com maybe, Libro.fm. I used to joke about J.K. Rowling sponsoring the show. There was always a joke. That's maybe funny. What, less and less funny as time goes by. Smaller and smaller as the years go by. Is at the end of that Larkin poem. All right, so I am going to sign off, but is that my air conditioning? All right, that's probably very loud. I'm going to sign off, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put at the end a little preview of the latest Secret Show episode. I'm going to try to start doing that just at the end of episodes so that if you don't subscribe to The Secret Show, you can hear a preview. If you do subscribe, then you can just end the episode, early. Because I think there's some fun stuff. It's like some, like, things are getting intense at the moment on there. But always a lot of fun, and I hope you will go to sleeverickets.substack.com and check it out. If you put your email address in there, I will give you a week's access for free, and you can hear 80 plus episodes and a new one every week. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleeverickets@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Now, stick around for a preview of The Secret Show.
Is there really a difference between like men and women's sexual attraction? And if so, what is it?
Alice?
Alice? You're like bi. Say something.
I like bi.
Say something queer. Say something clever.
Oh boy. What was the question? Is there a difference between men and women's attraction?
Yeah.
And what do women find attractive?
I don't want to do this.
Big muscles. Lots of weapons.
Oh God. I definitely can't do this bit. I can talk about, I suppose I could like have a stab at like what I find attractive.
Yeah,
which
please.
is
I mean,
like,
if you're comfortable, just do what you want.
no, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable at all. This is the worst. I should have been back at work like half an hour ago, and I'm still sitting here.
Isn't this slightly more fun than work though?
Yeah, it's way more fun, but also like I'm gonna regret it so hard. Okay, what do I find attractive? I came across this term a little while ago, which I actually don't think is anything, but it interested me for about 5 seconds. Sapiosexual, which is just like you really, really into an intellectual connection with someone. Like that's the primary thing for me. When I first got to know Tom by email.
Yeah.
And I kind of remembered what he looked like from high school, but it was a while ago. But like I just was obsessed with, this is back in 2001. I was in Japan. I didn't have regular access to the internet, but once he started emailing me and we started talking, I could have been anywhere in the world. I just basically wrote off the last 2 months of my exchange year because I was like, I need to get to the internet. I need to talk to this person. And I couldn't admit to myself yet at that point that I was like attracted to him because like I was gay. I was super gay, but I just really needed to like read these emails.
But that started up from the correspondence. It wasn't like, oh, yes, I remember him being cute. It was like, I remember him being a physical man. And
yeah, I remember that he had a physical form, right. But it was just like, yeah, and then he sent me a mixtape.
Oh man, deadly.
Gosh. And then, yeah, so I listened to that 1,000 times. And then when I met, like by the time I met him, I was just so far gone. But, inconveniently, he was going out with my best friend. But we worked through that, as 19-year-olds do, in a very terrible way. But like, yeah, I think for me, it's always just, can I connect with this person on an intellectual level? Like the physical stuff is so, it's not like it doesn't matter at all. But I feel like if I connect with someone in that way, like everything about them just becomes just gloriously attractive and gorgeous to me.
Okay. That's really interesting. It's also kind of funny because my friends like constantly accuse me of being like a sapiosexual, and I'm like,
I think it's dumb. I think it's a dumb term. I don't think we need that one. I think we can chuck it. Like, no, fuck that.
Also, like, is that even true? Like, it sounds like it's not just that you're attracted to intelligence, but you're attracted to a certain personality, right? Like that's like not just
the mind was
the consciousness.
Like you're
it's not just like it's not just it's not just like smartness. Like it's not just like knowing things, although that is.
He just sent you math equations in your email.
Yeah.
Like, I did this in my head. Like, God, I'm so wet. If you'd like to hear more of that episode, along with about 80 odd others, go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up for The Secret Show. It's pretty fucking cheap. All right. Talk to you later.